Hello, and welcome to this webinar with Cloud Academy, Demystifying Multi-Cloud for Your Organization. I want to thank everyone for attending. This webinar is being recorded, and we will have time for questions at the end of our discussion. We will also send a link to the recording to each of you very soon. Now I'd like to introduce everyone on the call. First, my name is John Schell. I'm the Assessment Lead for Cloud Academy. We also have Stuart Scott, the AWS Content Lead.
Hi, John.
We have Guy Hummel, our Azure and Google Cloud Content Lead.
Hello.
And finally, we have Tom Mitchell, Azure and GCP Trainer.
Hello.
I'd like to start off by defining what we mean by multi-cloud. It is a popular topic right now, but it can mean very different things. In RightScale's 2019 State of the Cloud report, which surveyed over 700 businesses, 84% described their organization as multi-cloud. However, when many of these organizations said they were multi-cloud, they meant that they use both a public and private cloud, or in a few cases, they use multiple private clouds. You should know for this webinar, we will focus on one specific multi-cloud model, and that is using multiple public cloud platforms, focusing specifically on market leaders, AWS, Azure, and GCP. There are a few general approaches to multi-cloud. Tom, could you tell us more about them?
Sure, John. There are essentially four key approaches to multi-cloud. They include split cloud, multi-cloud DR, multi-cloud HA, and cost management or cloud arbitrage. The split cloud model is really the most common and simplest form of multi-cloud. This model uses one cloud platform to host an organization's test or dev environment, but another separate platform to run production workloads. Now, another take on the split cloud model would take a production environment and then simply split this production environment into multiple cloud platforms. Organizations will often do this to take advantage of services, features, or pricing that is available only in one specific platform or another. The multi-cloud DR model, or sometimes known cloud disaster recovery, is a more recent and actually more complex multi-cloud approach. When you take this multi-cloud approach to DR, what you typically do is run your production apps in one cloud platform while maintaining a separate up-to-date copy of those apps on another platform. Now, although the two models I've just discussed, or the two approaches, the split cloud and the multi-cloud DR approaches, both result in different workloads running on separate platforms. The operation or hosting of a single application across multiple cloud platforms results in what is essentially an active-active HA deployment of that app across those platforms. This type of solution protects those apps from things like DNS DDoS attacks, regional failures, and even failures of an entire cloud provider. This type of solution results in a recovery point objective, or RPO, that's theoretically zero in the case of a failure that affects one cloud platform. The least common model in practice is sometimes called the cost management approach or cloud arbitrage. In this approach, an organization's workloads are dynamically placed on the cloud platform that has the most competitive infrastructure at the time of the deployment. This type of solution isn't the easiest to deploy, and there are often lots of challenges to making it work. Now, that being said, as solutions like Kubernetes improve, you'll likely see more and more organizations try to leverage this approach in order to better manage costs.
Thank you, Tom. So now that we've defined the multi-cloud and gone over some of the general approaches, I'd like to move on and discuss some of the benefits. What would you say, I'd like to open this up to everyone at the table here. What would you say are the benefits of using more than one public cloud?
One of the most common reasons that you hear from organizations is avoiding vendor lock-in. So most organizations want to be in a position where they can move to another cloud provider in the future if they need to. And by using multiple clouds now, it's easier to architect your infrastructure so you're not dependent on one particular cloud provider. And to truly avoid vendor lock-in, you should avoid platform-specific services. So for example, if you are using, say, Amazon Aurora, that is a proprietary database, and it would be more difficult for you to move to another cloud platform than if you were using, let's say, just straight up MySQL. Or another example would be Amazon has two different container services. They have ECS, which is Elastic Container Service, and they have EKS, which is Elastic Kubernetes Service. And although if you used ECS, you could still move your containers to another platform, it would be a lot easier if you were using EKS. So those are the kinds of things that you need to look at when you're architecting to avoid vendor lock-in. But the trade-off with this approach is that it might not give you the full benefit of the platform. If you're avoiding these platform-specific services, you might actually be losing some of the benefits of that platform. So
another benefit is pricing. This comes up quite a lot as well. Of course, when you have multiple vendors which all focus on different cloud services, it makes way for some competitive pricing between those vendors and across the platforms. So depending on which vendor you're looking at, you'll see some have more of a range of a particular category. Let's say for compute, for example, if one vendor had 15 compute services and another had 5, then the one with the additional services will have additional offerings, and they will have the capacity to implement a more varied and scaled approach to the cost of those compute services when compared to the vendor with just the 5. So with that in mind, you might be able to find a more cost-effective offering using the vendor with a more flexible cost plan. So having this freedom and flexibility of the different public cloud offerings, you're easily able to leverage the most optimum and most cost-effective service for your required workload across all cloud providers instead of just a single cloud provider.
Another one is performance. Although this is actually not as commonly used as a reason for using multi-cloud these days. So originally the idea was that because each of the cloud providers had data centers in different locations, and you might have one cloud provider that just happens to have a data center in, I don't know, let's say Sydney, Australia or something like that, and maybe another cloud provider didn't, then you might want to have a multi-cloud model where the one that has the data center in Sydney, you would put your application in that cloud provider for that particular part of the globe, and the people who would be accessing it from there would have lower network latency, and so they'd have better performance and better responsiveness from that application. But all three of the providers have been adding data centers all over the place, and there actually aren't very many situations anymore where you would have one cloud provider that would have significantly better network response than another would.
And just on that note, actually, Guy, you mentioned having data centers in different locations. With data stored in particular countries, you might have to comply with specific regulations and laws for data. And if you're looking to use a provider that doesn't offer full compliance, then you can design your application or solution with a different vendor that does in that region. So you can select a vendor based on its compliance programs that it has, and if you check out each of the vendors' websites, there's always a security compliance section, so you can find out all the compliance that they have and that they comply to. And this allows you to maintain your compliance for your different workloads that you might need to run. Now, using managed services that are fully compliant with a specific regulation, for example, PCI DSS or HIPAA, is one thing, but operating and running your application and its data and maintaining that compliance is something totally different. So there's an element on you to ensure that you maintain that compliance. And to help you do this, each vendor offers a range of different services to help you manage your operational compliance across your infrastructure. For example, with AWS, you can use AWS config to enforce specific rules that check the compliance of your resources against specific controls. And these rules can be predefined, or they could be custom rules to match exactly what you need within your organization. Or you can use AWS CloudTrail, which is a service that records and tracks all AWS API requests made across your infrastructure. And these can be initiated from someone using an SDK or the AWS command line interface, the CLI, or from within the AWS Management Console, or even from a request made by another AWS service. So it becomes a really powerful auditing tool. So be sure to check out those tools with those vendors as well.
Thank you, Stu, and everyone. You know, we so far have discussed the public cloud and multi-cloud approaches very generally in terms of the benefits and the approaches. I'd like to move on to the specific platforms that we're each discussing here and focusing on. Those would be AWS, GCP, and Azure. And I'm wondering if each of you could tell me what you think are the particular strengths of each of the public platforms.
Okay, I'll jump in with AWS, just from a very high level perspective. I'd say AWS is probably recognized as one of the most mature public cloud vendors with the broadest range of services. And the rate of innovation at AWS astounds me kind of month on month, year on year, and it's difficult to keep up with the new services being released and the rate of updates and enhancements to existing services. And this is going to explode again with the upcoming reInvent in December. So I'm expecting lots of new services, lots of new updates coming there. And it's also seen as the market leader within the infrastructure as a service space as well. Now, I just mentioned reInvent, but during last year's reInvent, there was a huge emphasis on machine learning, and AWS has really ramped. And they now even have a dedicated certification for it as well. So it's pretty strong in this area at the moment.
I could jump in with GCP next and have a little bit of a counterpoint maybe to what Stu just said, actually, because I think when people look at Google Cloud Platform, probably the most generally recognized strength of GCP is the AI and machine learning parts of it. Google has really been a pioneer in this area, and one of the obvious examples of that is that they were the ones who came up with TensorFlow and then open sourced it, and it's now been adopted by basically everybody. It's the #1 machine learning framework out there, and it's being used heavily on Azure and AWS as well. And Google has been the pioneer in so many different areas of AI and machine learning. So, you know, one other example is that they were the first provider to come out with their own specialized chips that were designed to speed up TensorFlow workloads. And so they have these chips called TPUs, which are tensor processing units. And they came out with that significantly before anybody else did. So, you know, I'm just saying.
Just the point.
Yeah, that's right.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. So, you know, if you're looking at GCP, that's probably the reason that you're looking at them is in that area, or maybe in data analytics or one of those places, because that's really where Google shines. The other thing is that so Google actually has a much greater incentive to make multi-cloud work because they're in third place in the market, right? AWS is first, and Azure is quickly catching up. GCP is quite a bit behind, and so because of that, I mean, it still has a fairly significant market share, but it's not anywhere near what AWS and Azure are. And so they seem to have come up with this strategy of making it very easy for customers to move between the different cloud platforms because they want to take the customers who are already on AWS and Azure and have them bring GCP into their multi-cloud mix. And so they've been doing things like they came out with Kubernetes, right? So I already mentioned TensorFlow before in the AI part of things. And that was a very successful strategy because it's as long as people are writing their machine learning applications in TensorFlow, then they can very easily move them from one cloud platform to another. They're doing the same thing with Kubernetes, where Kubernetes is a container orchestration system. And it's a very sophisticated one because Google had been using it internally for a long time, and they decided to open source it and make it available to everyone. And it has very quickly taken over the industry. And now it's much easier to move containers between the different cloud platforms. And so, in fact, even though both AWS and Azure already had their own container management services that were proprietary, they have both come out with Kubernetes services as well because there's been so much demand for it. So Google's strategy there seems to be working, and they just keep moving with that. So they've got another thing called Anthos, which is Kubernetes plus some additional tools on top of that. And just in general, Google is really big on open source. They have very strong partnerships with open source companies, aside from coming out with their own open source tools. And so if your organization is really strong on open source, then GCP would be a pretty reasonable choice for deploying these things to the cloud.
Well, I guess I'll cover Azure here. Azure really, really shines for organizations that are more heavily invested in the Microsoft ecosystem already. Programs and offerings like the enterprise agreements and the Azure hybrid benefit, they allow organizations to save money on cloud resources, while closer-knit integration options provide existing Microsoft customers with easier integration of on-prem solutions with cloud solutions. As far as the enterprise agreements go, if an organization already uses Microsoft software, they'll typically have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft already in place. And what this does is entitles that organization to obtain discounts on the Microsoft software being used. And this is because Microsoft will usually tweak these agreements to lower the pricing of Azure. So with enterprise agreements, organizations can typically obtain significant incentives for using Azure. The Azure hybrid benefit is a specific pricing benefit for customers who have licenses with software assurance. What this does is allow organizations to maximize the value of their existing on-prem Windows Server and or SQL Server licensing investments whenever they decide to migrate to Azure. Customers that are eligible for the Azure hybrid benefit can save up to 40% on Azure VMs, and even higher discounts up to 55% on Azure SQL databases and SQL Server on Azure VMs. So there's a significant cost advantage through the Azure hybrid benefit to go with an Azure solution. As far as integrations go, organizations that leverage Azure AD are typically able to better integrate their on-prem AD environments with Azure using the Azure AD Connect software. What the Azure AD Connect service does is ensures that identity information that's stored in the Azure AD is consistent with whatever is in the on-prem AD. With the tight integration that Azure offers, organizations can then streamline user provisioning and user management.
Great. Thank you, Tom, and of course, Stu and Guy. So now we've discussed some of the general strengths of each of the platforms and some of the benefits for multi-cloud, but there's, of course, the other side of the coin there. Research also indicates that multi-cloud has its challenges, and largely this is as a result of the increased complexity. What would each of you see as key challenges to using multiple public clouds?
Well, I would say that probably the most obvious challenge is management. How do you manage all these resources and services in your different cloud platforms? So there are lots of third-party tools for multi-cloud management, but even the three major cloud providers do have some multi-cloud capabilities. And actually, I just wanted to add to what Tom was just talking about with Active Directory and how using Azure AD Connect, it's very easy to synchronize your on-prem Active Directory with what you have in the cloud. That's actually the case for the other two cloud providers as well. So you can synchronize your Active Directory with GCP and AWS as well. And so actually you could look at that as being a multi-cloud management tool in the identity area.
Sure.
So some of the other areas, there's cost management. And so as I mentioned, there are lots of third-party tools for doing multi-cloud management. And so there are in the cost management area as well. So I'm going to focus on the ones that are that one of the three cloud providers already provides. So in this area, I find it quite interesting that Azure Cost Management actually supports all three platforms. So you could, in theory, just use that to to manage your costs in all three. And for monitoring, Google has Stackdriver, which is the equivalent of AWS CloudWatch. And Stackdriver can actually monitor both GCP resources and AWS resources. Not sure why they chose not to include Azure in that.
So, yeah, I'm often wonder that myself.
Yeah, that's kind of odd, but
yeah.
But they do at least do two of them. And as far as deployments go, so you could, with each of the platforms, they have their own deployment services that work really well to automate deployments, like CloudFormation in the case of AWS, and Google Deployment Manager, and Azure has Azure Resource Manager templates and things like that. But if you want one that's cloud agnostic that will deploy using all of those services, then you could use something like Terraform, which has plugins basically for all of these different services. So there are ways to do cross-platform deployment. And as I've already mentioned, Kubernetes, if you use containers, it's a lot easier to handle putting things on multiple platforms. So Docker container, I mean, Docker is definitely the standard for containers. So if you use Docker containers, and also if you use Kubernetes orchestration, then it's very easy for you to move applications from one cloud platform to another. And so that's a good management tool in essence. And these the three main cloud providers aren't the only ones who have bought into Kubernetes. So you also have things like Red Hat. Red Hat has OpenShift, which is based on Kubernetes. And there's also VMware has PKS. The K in that stands for Kubernetes. So there are lots and lots of tools that you can use to manage Kubernetes deployments. And so that's a great way to handle management. And as I mentioned earlier, Google has also, they've come out with this new open source one called Anthos, which is Kubernetes plus service mesh and some other management tools to make it even easier to move applications from, like, really sophisticated applications using microservices from one place to another, even from on-premises to the different cloud providers. So there are lots of management tools out there, but frankly, it's still in the very early days of this, and there are really no clear leaders in terms of multi-cloud management.
So just following on the back of your management point there, Guy, I'd also say design and deployment complexity as well. Because depending on your implementation of multi-cloud, for example, let's say you're using 2 or more public clouds to run the same application or service, perhaps for high availability, then there's going to be both architectural and deployment challenges when you're doing that. So let's look at, let's look at data, for example. If you're storing the same data across these clouds, then it can be difficult to maintain data consistency across multiple locations for that specific application or solution. You want to ensure that all your data remains up to date across all the vendors. And this also adds complexity in when you're trying to search and retrieve specific data in the most cost-effective and performant way as well. Now, not to mention the fact that different vendors will be using different APIs, different security controls, and authentication mechanisms and data formats. So there's a lot to consider when using multiple clouds when it comes to your design and deployment. And I would say kind of falls in line with management there as well, based on what you were saying as well, Guy. And also security as well. I'll just highlight a couple of points. There's going to be different security frameworks that each vendor is going to be used, so you're going to have to navigate each of those. And with that, we have, unfortunately, it ultimately expands your attack surface as well. And you'll have an increase in the amount of IAM, which is Identity and Access Management, users, roles, and groups to manage. And you need to understand where you stand within the shared responsibility framework for each security vendor. So, and that's a key point. You really need to understand where your security boundaries start and finish between each cloud platform that you're going to be using. It might be slightly different between each platform, so make sure you have a solid understanding of that. And also, you might have existing tool sets. So do your existing security tool sets and monitoring solutions work with additional partners to enable you to create a centralized and orchestrated security point? And it becomes an ongoing development to implement security across multiple clouds. And it's something that needs to be consistently and continually addressed and assessed and reviewed regularly to ensure you're not exposing yourself to any new vulnerabilities.
Wow, thank you, Stu. So clearly, we've discussed security, deployment, and management. In our discussion so far, it's clear that you need to understand not only what a particular cloud platform offers, but also understanding multiple third-party tools is going to be essential in terms of making the best use of multiple clouds and the solutions deployed on them. Clearly, one of the issues with multi-cloud approach is that it requires a wider area of expertise and a wider technical knowledge. So what challenges do enterprises face in hiring and training for a multi-cloud environment?
So there's always going to be nuances between the different vendors. So how to configure and implement different cloud providers is going to change slightly between each, depending on what kind of service you're using. So it's going to definitely require a broad and deep knowledge across each of those vendors. So you're going to have subject matter experts covering each vendor and different categories as well. For example, security, data, compute, machine learning, AI, etc. So when you're going multi-cloud, it does require a considerable amount of effort from your team.
Yeah, and you're unlikely to have a whole team of people who are up to speed on all three of the cloud platforms, right? And all of
that's the dream.
Yeah, and all of the third-party management tools. I mean, you might actually get a few people who have pretty decent knowledge of all of them, but they're probably going to be pretty rare. And frankly, you'll need specialists in each one of these areas. But so from a hiring perspective, that's an issue, right? I mean, first of all, the people that you hire are probably not going to have all of the existing knowledge that they need. But then, as Stu was mentioning earlier, every time the vendors announce all these new services that they have coming out, all these updates, people need to learn all these things. And so there is a constant need for training.
One of the things you'd have to consider is if you have a multi-cloud solution, having one person trained in all three clouds, you can get that training, but at that point, if you don't use what you've learned, what good is that training? Right. So when you're looking at hiring and training your team, I'm not a big proponent of siloing, but there's almost a benefit to that to some degree, because if 2/3 of my organization runs on Azure and 1/3 of it runs on AWS, and I am the only guy on staff and I learn both technologies or both platforms, if 2/3 of my time is spent managing Azure resources all day, every day, and 1/3 of my time is on AWS, I'll tend to lose that knowledge. So it almost presents a challenge in terms of not only teaching the technology, but how do you make up your team? Do you keep one person that knows everything, the jack of all trades, or do you hire multiple people with a focus on each individual cloud provider with some other background knowledge on the other platforms?
Right. Yeah, I suppose there's no right or wrong way. It's going to be whatever is the most beneficial for your business.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Before we begin taking questions, I do want to mention that Cloud Academy is designed to help organizations train their IT departments. Cloud Academy offers courses, hands-on labs, and exams on AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform, as well as many cross-platform tools that we've mentioned today, such as Terraform, Kubernetes, and TensorFlow, to name a few. Our training resources will help any organization prepare and stay up to date as it manages resources in the cloud. With that, let's take a look at some of the questions we've received so far. First question, where does multi-cloud fit as a step in cloud migration? Should my business migrate to one before trying multiple platforms?
All right, John, I'll jump on this one. And it a lot of it's going to be dependent on your business and your goals, but multi-cloud can almost be viewed as, I guess, a potential end game. What I would recommend is that an organization evaluate the different platforms and then deciding which platform best addresses the organization's needs. And then from there, what you would typically do is migrate to that platform that best suits your organization, while at the same time keeping an eye toward how the other platforms would fit into a potential multi-cloud strategy for your organization.
I'd also say as well, whilst you're doing that, migrating to the first cloud, just make sure you architect your application solution to enable it to span to cross cloud platforms as well. So just kind of bear that in mind as you're doing that migration.
Yeah, it's always easier to make that transition to multi-cloud if you planned it ahead of time.
Yeah, just have that as foresight.
Exactly.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. How easy is it to move apps between clouds?
Well, I'd say it depends, of course, which is a typical answer from a consultant especially.
Right.
But it depends because, well, if you've used platform-specific services to build and deploy your apps, then it's going to be much more difficult. It can still be done, of course, but it's always going to take more work if you've done that, because you'll have to convert it to something that isn't platform-specific. Which is why I always recommend using containers, especially. I mean, even if you're using VMs, like, you don't have to go the container route. If you have VM-based applications, then it's probably not too hard to move them from one to the other, although those VMs do have to talk to other services typically, so you still have,
right.
You have other integration points. But but if you've used containers, it does help a lot. And if you've used other container-based tools and you've architected things in such a way that it is fairly easy to move apps between cloud providers, then of course it's going to be easy. So that's why I say it depends. Really, it comes down to how well you've planned ahead of time. Architecting your applications so that they can move one to the other.
Yeah, that seems to be a theme so far.
Mm-hmm.
Containers is key.
Well, and having the forethought to right,
Right, exactly.
to build things for a multi.
And again, it just comes down to kind of design and implementation as well.
Yeah, but I guess we should also say that most people are not starting off with a blank slate here. It's not like, okay, let's get started and create some new applications. Let's architect them.
Right. These applications may have been deployed, 5 years ago.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
There was no plan ahead at that point. So.
Right, and so moving those ones around between clouds is going to be much more difficult. But
unless you re-architect them.
Yeah.
Which again is time and cost and effort, which not everyone has, unfortunately.
Yeah, and so that's sort of the two main approaches: is lift and shift, or re-architect. Right. And I mean, there are other variations in between, but those are kind of the.
So going back to the answer at the start, it depends.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
Great. Well, this looks like the last question. Is there anything wrong with using just one cloud platform and not doing multi-cloud? What do you think?
No. As long as you're okay with the potential downsides of that, which we discussed earlier, like potential vendor lock-in from just being on one platform. Not being able to take advantage of lower prices from the other vendors, the risk of your chosen provider going down, and not having an alternative solution available while that provider is down. And basically all the things that we mentioned as being the advantages. If you're okay with not having those particular advantages, then that's fine, of course. But it depends on your use case, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, I mean, it may also depend on your staff. I mean, a small company that's 25 people may have one IT guy, so teaching him everything may not fit. I mean, it may not work. So
right.
Again, like Guy said, it gets back to lock-in. It gets back to how your organization's built. It's just lots of. I hate to say it, it depends, but generally speaking, I mean, it's I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with it.
No, and I kind of Guy touched on it as well. It goes down to use case, because you might have an application that isn't, key to your business that you just need on the cloud, you might not need a multi-cloud approach for that application. And also, you mentioned about taking advantage of lower prices, which is definitely true. But if you might not want to use multi-cloud for a particular reason, because obviously you'll be charged twice depending on what you're using the multi-cloud for.
Right.
So you might not have the budget, or it might not need that amount of investment for your solution that you've implemented. So if it's just a fairly simple application that doesn't need high resilience across multiple cloud vendors and backup across cloud vendors, etc., then there's absolutely nothing wrong with just using one cloud platform.
Yeah, it seems like the common theme is really as close analysis as you can afford into what your needs are and what's going to best suit those needs.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's an ideal world scenario, but
Right.
it doesn't fit for
Doesn't fit
everything.
everybody.
You know?
Right, of course.
So,
Yep.
Well, that was our last question for today. So that will conclude our webinar. I want to thank you, Stu, Guy, and Tom for joining us for this webinar, and thanks to everyone for attending. This webinar has been recorded again, and we will send out links to, with the recording to everyone who has registered very soon. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.
cheers, John.